Hi there and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. Apologies to regular listeners, we've been on something of a holiday. Well, it's not really a holiday for me, I've been moving house, which has been, as most people know, an unbearable hell. But here we are in the new Explaining History headquarters. I finally have my own little kind of recording studio, so that means I'll be able to put out an awful lot more material in the near future, podcasts, videos and other useful stuff. So if you're studying history or you're just an enthusiast and passionate about modern history, this is the place for you. Anyway, so the thing that I'm going to be talking a little bit about today is the Atlantic Charter, which was a broad set of principles that were agreed upon between Churchill and Roosevelt at their first meeting in August 1941, before the USA enters the war. But by that time, America had already kind of given a substantial and clear commitment to the Allied cause in terms of Lend-Lease and in terms of actually engaging with the German Navy at sea. There had been really an ongoing war between America and Germany throughout much of 1941. As German U-boats saw American shipping as fair game, and American naval orders were to fire on German shipping at any available opportunities. So the Atlantic Charter Conference met in Placentia Bay off the coast of Newfoundland. It was one of the great, most secret meetings of the war at that point, and it involved Churchill travelling to the coast of Newfoundland in the new cruiser, the Prince of Wales, which was to be sunk by the Japanese the following year, and was currently the pride of the Royal Navy. It goes down off Malaya in early 1942. Roosevelt emerged on the USS Augusta, and the Augusta was accompanied by a large flotilla of destroyers and cruisers, whereas the Prince of Wales was really on its own. And the secrecy with which Roosevelt had to make his way to Placentia Bay bordered on the slightly farcical. He was spirited away on his own yacht, which was sailed to the Augusta, and he used a decoy, a sailor dressed up as him, to lure the press away. And there was a very good reason for this, because not all the American press was entirely in favour of intervention in the war, and the idea that Roosevelt was taking part in secret wartime conferences with Churchill was enough to bring about a crisis within American politics, partly from the isolationists and the anti-war lobby. And there was, by this point, still a small and vocal pro-German lobby, even though the events of really the Battle of Britain had boosted an enormous amount of public support for Britain, and there was a clear understanding in America developing that liberal democracy was under serious threat, and the American public opinion, whilst shifting behind Britain, wasn't quite ready for open intervention in the war. And that would only really come after Pearl Harbor. So Roosevelt couldn't be seen to be taking America into war, even at this point in late 1941. Not, of course, that's what the not that that's what the meeting was about anyway. Really, there was no indication from Roosevelt that he was prepared, whilst attending the conference, to really commit to the British cause. There were far too many questions for Roosevelt to answer. I think he was aware that war would have to be waged against Germany at some point. However, the concern on Roosevelt's part really was the terms on which America would be waging war. Was America, for example, going to be waging war to help prop up the British Empire, something that would be entirely counterproductive and unwanted on a huge scale across America? Not because there was some sort of preordained belief in anti-imperial and anti-colonial sentiment across America, but by and large because the British Empire was the clear trading rival to the United States, and one which was seen by many Americans as an antiquated and unfair, commercially unfair institution that cut America out of global markets, something that could not be tolerated. And part of the long-term American strategy for the Second World War was obviously to beat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, but it was really also about prizing Britain's grasp of global trade to replace the British Empire as a trading entity with the United States of America. And this is all really done by the undermining of the pound and the removal of currency controls on the pound, which was Britain's way of artificially propping up the pound's value. And for a country that was becoming seriously indebted, a pound with a high value was extremely important. It regulated how quickly one could repay one's debts. Churchill first set foot on the Augusta with his delegation, and when he met Roosevelt, he was really meeting somebody who had similar, if not identical, experiences and a background to Churchill. Both of them were were statesmen of an aristocratic descent. Roosevelt was from one of the great American political dynasties, and for a republic based on broadly egalitarian principles, he was the closest thing to an aristocrat that America had. And Churchill obviously was from the Marlborough family and was steeped in the martial traditions of his family, of Britain, and of the English-speaking peoples, of which he wrote about extensively. And part of the reason for the meeting was to draft out these broad principles and find broad areas of agreement that both men could embrace. I think from Churchill's point of view, Churchill's historical memory stretches all the way back to the Magna Carta and to the first drafting of kind of legal principles that enshrine individual rights and liberty. And he saw what was happening at Placentia Bay as really the next part in that chapter, that the civilization of the English-speaking races, and we know that there are plenty of exceptions during the war to this notion of this so-called civilization, from the Bengal famine to the atomic bomb. But this civilization based on the rule of law must now stand together against a barbarism the likes of which humanity has never seen before. And it must stand together on broadly legalistic and democratic principles. So it's interesting that, and no coincidence really, that it's from the Atlantic Charter that the principles upon which the war is supposedly fought and upon which the post-war world was meant to be based stem. The further deliberations at meetings such as Potsdam and Yalta, and then the foundation of the UN, can be traced back really to the discussions that are had on board the Augusta and the Prince of Wales during the Atlantic Charter conferences. It had been the fall of France really that had shaken Roosevelt and had eliminated in his mind any doubt that war would at some point be necessary with Nazi Germany. He'd seen democracies in Europe swept away and really looked at with fear at the fate of Britain during the Battle of Britain and the planned invasion Operation Sea Lion by Nazi Germany. He couldn't go to war without congressional approval, which really ties his hands. And he says that after the fall of France, that things have changed, conditions have changed, and that we are not existing in a situation that is favourable to America any longer, and a situation where America can continue to keep its head in the sand. He tries to step beyond Congress to appeal to the rest of the nation with his various fireside chats. And by using, he campaigns in his inaugural speech in January 1941, that he campaigns on the subject of the four freedoms, of the freedom of speech and religion, and the freedom from want and the freedom from fear. And it was a way of trying to suggest to the American people that they were kind of already in the war, that they actually had common cause with the Allies, that these freedoms are actually under threat in America, whether they like it or not. So he managed to be able to introduce, throughout 1941, the Lend-Lease Agreement, which is a kind of a halfway house between intervention and assistance, and it was something that could placate Congress while being able to keep Britain going. And it was seen in a cross-partisan way that keeping Britain going was vitally important. The Lend-Lease Act was passed in March 1941, and without sort of the knowledge of the general public, American forces were targets for German U-boats, and had been designated, had been given the role of defending convoys all the way from the north of America to Britain, and started to trade shots with the Germans. So America, as I said previously, America was kind of in a state of undeclared war by late 1941, and Roosevelt needed now really the opportunity to have a crisis to come along to persuade Congress really to back him for full intervention. So the conference itself takes 4 days, from the 9th of August through to the 12th. And the main events take place on the Augusta and the Prince of Wales, and there are some rather sumptuous dinners between Roosevelt and Churchill, where they talk late into the night about politics and history and the shared relationship between Britain and America. But there are also some other little meetings happening between economic advisors, military advisors, naval attaches, between the British and the Americans, discussing about how cooperation could take place. The Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's advisor, had already been to Moscow, and he fed back to the attendants his understanding of how things were working in the Soviet Union and the likelihood of cooperation with Stalin's Russia. And there was kind of a lot of theatre. There were various church services on between the two sides, and the playing of national anthems. And it was a kind of a love-in, if you will, between both sides, and a way of sounding one another out to see where the elements of commonality lay. So there was no firm agenda, and there was no agreed result on what the outcome of the conference was. The two men, Churchill and Roosevelt, both were kind of highly emotionally intelligent men, if you will, and they believed that getting the measure of one another and building that kind of relationship was the first step to other things coming of it. And in a way, when Churchill goes to Moscow, he has a similar encounter with, well, actually quite different, but a similar in some ways encounter with Stalin, in that he and Stalin were staring one another down, getting the measure of one another, and tensions are broken really over sort of huge amounts of alcohol, which was a favourite of both men. There was as I said, the initiative really was to set out broad principles, which was, I suppose, a kind of a continuation of Wilson's 14 points. It had been those 14 points during the First World War, when America enters the war on the side of Britain and France as an associated power, which was an attempt really to kind of steer the war aims towards kind of a more Wilsonian liberal principles, which had not been kind of part of the Anglo-French agenda up until that point. And now, once again, Roosevelt would have great difficulty making the case for intervention into the war without having some sort of agenda to tell Americans, the reasons why America was fighting, and America had to be seen, if intervening, if it was going to intervene, to be doing things for kind of largely liberal reasons. The alternative was to be fighting a war that was based on largely Anglo-French imperial aggrandizement, which no doubt at the end of a successful war, a Versailles-like treaty, if that were to happen, would be in the interests of old imperial powers and would help to preserve their empires, or perhaps even expand them, as happened in 1919. So 5 general principles were set out. So there would be no aggrandizement by either country. So no country would gain from the war. The British would not become richer as a result of the war or have any territorial enhancement, neither would America. There would be no territorial changes without the consent of peoples concerned. So there would be no repeat of the mistakes of Versailles, where people are shunted around and lines are drawn on the map. Freedom of speech and the choice of government would be upheld. So democratic principles would be upheld. And I guess really these fairly new notions of liberalism and liberal democracy are included within the kind of the language of war aims, because of the horrific excesses and the horrific reputation of Nazi Germany. There would be fair distribution of essential produce. So once again, when the lines on the map were drawn up at the end of the Second World War, places like the coal mines of Silesia would be divided fairly between Germany and Poland. One of the arguments as to why Versailles breaks down is the desire by Germany to get its hands on resources that it believed were rightfully theirs. And there would be an effective international organisation, with the emphasis on effective, so a replacement to the League of Nations. So already at this point, there was still a recognition that some sort of legal framework for the world needed to exist, some sort of international organisation. What its role would be, the extent to which it could do peacekeeping, arbitration, was unclear at this point. But it would be an organisation that would be able to guarantee global security, so one which would probably have more teeth than the League of Nations. When you get to 1943, 1944, when you find official pronouncements by Roosevelt and Churchill, and particularly generals such as Eisenhower, referring to the United Nations. So the United Nations, they're not referring to the things like the General Assembly of the United Nations and the United Nations as we understand it now, but they're referring to a union of nations, a unity of nations fighting Nazism. So these broad principles, as we know, tragically, when we get to conferences like Potsdam, unfortunately Stalin is able to influence the facts on the ground by the many millions of Soviet troops in Eastern Europe. And so the rights of peoples to choose their governments democratically is rather swept away. And there are borders and boundaries are divided and are drawn up, and countries are divided based largely on the will of the Soviet Union. So one of the tragedies, I think, of the Placentia Bay meeting of the Atlantic Charter is that it is only applicable really when it's supported by the military force to back it up. By the end of the Second World War, whilst the British and Americans have fielded some impressively vast armies in order to counter Nazi Germany, they're rather dwarfed by the size of the Soviet Union. And even the existence of the atomic bomb doesn't change these facts on the ground. It perhaps preserves Asia from further Soviet conquest, but it doesn't save Eastern Europe. So the Atlantic Charter is rather negligible for them. Anyway, I hope this has been useful, and as I said, we're back on podcasting form now, and there will be plenty more to come. We've got some exciting new Explaining History titles out pretty shortly on the Paris Peace Conference, Victorian Britain, so look out for those, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast.